Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with that usual reminder to click like and subscribe and the notification bell before we begin. And don't forget to drop a comment saying where you're watching from or what you're up to while you listen. On a cold November morning in 1982, a Wyoming highway patrolman came upon an eerie scene. A Chevrolet Blazer idling on a remote off-ramp in the middle of the prairie, its doors wide open and personal belongings scattered across the asphalt. The driver, 35-year-old Don Kemp, was nowhere to be found. A single set of footprints trailed away from the vehicle into the snow, as if Kemp had calmly walked off into the wilderness. It would take nearly 3 years before Kemp's remains were finally discovered just a few miles from where his SUV was abandoned. By then, a series of baffling clues, including reported sightings and phone calls from after his disappearance, had turned his fate into one of Wyoming's strangest unsolved mysteries. Don Kemp wasn't an obvious candidate for vanishing into thin air, at least not until everything changed. In the late 1970s, he was a successful Madison Avenue advertising executive in New York City, intelligent, charismatic, and by all accounts, living the good life. However, a serious car accident in 1976 left him badly injured and needing several years to recover. As he recovered, Kemp became increasingly disillusioned with his high-powered lifestyle and began pursuing spiritual and historical interests. He developed an intense fascination with Abraham Lincoln, even claiming that through meditation, he had contacted one of the conspirators from 1865. By 1982, Kemp had grown deeply reflective and envisioned himself as some kind of prophet or messenger with a great truth to share. He often spoke of grand plans, at one point suggesting he would start a spiritual movement related to Lincoln's legacy in the mountains of Wyoming. Personally, I don't see the connection between Lincoln and Wyoming, but hey, maybe that's just me. Determined to reinvent his life, Don Kemp sold most of his belongings, ended his engagement, and set out in September 1982 on a road trip west to Wyoming. His destination was Jackson Hole, where he hoped the quiet beauty of the mountains would inspire him to write a book about Lincoln's death and his unconventional theories. Along the way, Kemp kept in touch with family via phone calls and postcards. But as he traveled, some friends and relatives noticed changes in his demeanor. In early November, one friend received a distressing call from Don, who was sobbing and almost hysterical for reasons that remain unclear. Others observed that he had become unusually withdrawn and fixated on esoteric topics, even watching movies about people vanishing when he stopped at motels. These signs, subtle at first, hinted that Kemp's mental state might have been deteriorating as he ventured farther from his familiar life. On November 15, 1982, the day before he disappeared, Don Kemp visited a small Western history museum in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Fittingly, it featured exhibits on Abraham Lincoln. He spent 2 hours wandering the galleries alone and spoke to no one. When he left, he accidentally left behind a briefcase containing some very important items. These included his traveler's checks, personal diaries, address book, and even the glasses he needed for driving. Museum staff later confirmed that Kemp phoned about the forgotten items and said he would return for it immediately, but he never showed up. That afternoon, he was seen at a gas station in Laramie and later near the Lincoln Memorial Monument along Interstate 80. This was the last confirmed sighting of Don Kemp while alive. By the next morning, his journey took a dramatic and mysterious turn. On November 16, 1982, at approximately 10 o'clock that morning, a cop found Don Kemp's 1981 Chevy Blazer abandoned near the remote Wagon Hound Rest area off I-80. The vehicle appeared oddly deserted, yet not broken down. The engine was still running. The radio played music into the empty expanse, and all the doors were open. Kemp's personal items were strewn about on the ground, as if dumped or hastily pulled out of the car. 40 miles of empty land separated this spot from the nearest town, making the scene all the more perplexing. Aside from the scattered possessions, the only clue to Don's fate was a single set of footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the roadway and out into the open prairie. There were no tracks suggesting a second person, and the packed contents of the Blazer left little room for any passenger but Kemp himself. It appeared as though he had walked off on his own into the freezing wilderness, a behavior that struck investigators as irrational and dangerous given the winter conditions. A search began immediately, and the cops treated it as a missing person case with no initial suspicion of foul play. Deputies and volunteers scoured the area on foot and by air, following Don Kemp's footprints into the open prairie. About a mile from the highway, searchers found a duffel bag in the sagebrush containing Don's belongings. The tracks continued for miles, leading to an old barn roughly 6 miles from the abandoned car. Inside was a crude campsite, sticks arranged as if for a fire, and 3 of Don's socks. Strangely, no footprints led away from the barn, and investigators believed someone had backtracked to hide their trail. This suggested to them that Don may have been deliberately avoiding searchers. On the 3rd day, a severe blizzard forced authorities to suspend the search. With brutal cold and heavy snow, investigators assumed Don had perished from exposure. For the next few years, the mystery only deepened, and no further trace of Don turned up until October 1985. A group of hunters stumbled upon human remains in a patch of sagebrush approximately 4 miles from the spot where the Blazer had been found. The skeleton was identified as Don Kemp. His wallet, driver's license, and other identification were still with the remains. An autopsy couldn't determine an exact cause of death, but found no obvious signs of trauma or foul play. The authorities determined Don had indeed died of exposure to the elements, probably within days of his disappearance, and his body simply went undiscovered. This explanation would seem to neatly close the case, but as it turned out, the evidence didn't add up. The case of Don Kemp veered from tragic to truly bizarre in the months following his disappearance. In the spring of 1983, some 5 months after Kemp presumably died in the Wyoming blizzard, witnesses began reporting that they had seen Don alive in the town of Casper, Wyoming. This is about 150 miles from the spot where his vehicle was abandoned. One person swore they spotted him browsing a traveling exhibit of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia in Casper, which is uncanny given Don's passionate interest in Lincoln's history. Around the same time, a bartender at a Casper tavern told Mary Kemp, his mother, that he distinctly remembered serving Don a drink. The man was certain it was Don because he recalled the customer's Maryland accent and friendly demeanor. These sightings suggested the tantalizing possibility that Don had somehow survived and secretly made his way to Casper. Even more startling was the evidence that came from Don Kemp's longtime friend and former colleague, Judy Aiello. In late February 1983, Judy returned to her New York City apartment after an extended trip overseas, unaware that Don was missing. When she checked her home answering machine, she discovered a series of voice messages left during her absence. The voice on the machine was undeniably Don's, speaking in an urgent tone and leaving a phone number where he could supposedly be reached. Judy was astonished, not only because the voice sounded like her friend, but also because her telephone number was unlisted and known to very few people. In total, she found multiple missed calls and at least 2 recorded messages from the period of late February to April 1983, all seemingly from Don Kemp. Notably, according to the official explanation, this was a time at which Don should have been long deceased. Alarmed and confused, Judy dialed the callback number that Don had provided. What happened next only compounded the mystery. A man answered the phone. Judy asked if Don Kemp was there, to which the person on the other end oddly replied, "Yes." Then he immediately backtracked, said Don was out, and tried to get Judy off the phone as soon as possible. Sensing that this individual knew something, Judy implored him to have Don return her call, but she never heard back. When Judy alerted Mary Kemp and the authorities about these messages, an investigation traced the mysterious phone number to a trailer on the outskirts of Casper. The trailer was being rented at the time by a young man named Mark Dennis, who quickly became a person of interest in Don's case. Mark Dennis was questioned multiple times by Natrona County investigators. He flatly denied having any knowledge of Don Kemp and claimed he never placed any calls to Judy's number. Dennis suggested that perhaps someone else had snuck into his trailer to use the phone line, or that the phone company had made some error. Indeed, it was hard to imagine how a stranger could have obtained Judy Aiello's private number unless Don himself provided it. Police showed Dennis a photograph of Don, but Dennis maintained he had never seen or met him. He even volunteered to take a polygraph test, which reportedly did not uncover any deception. Over the years, Don Kemp's strange death has prompted a range of theories, from the straightforward to the highly speculative. The simplest and officially accepted explanation is that Don experienced a mental breakdown or disorientation and wandered off into the wilderness voluntarily. Proponents of this theory point to Don's fragile psychological state, as well as a head injury suffered in the accident. The single set of footprints, lack of evidence of other people at the scene, and the fact his remains were ultimately found not far from where he disappeared bolster this view. In this scenario, the later phone calls would have to be either an elaborate hoax or a bizarre coincidence, which I find to be an unsatisfying explanation. Don's family firmly believed that he was a victim of foul play. Under this theory, Don encountered a sick puppy, or perhaps a pack of sick puppies, somewhere along that lonely Wyoming highway in November 1982. Under this theory, he was able to briefly place a call to Judy, though for some reason didn't call the police or his family. Officially, the case of Don Kemp is considered solved, though even investigators have admitted that the facts of the official narrative don't fully add up. While I can't square all the evidence, it seems like Don Kemp's mysterious behavior stems from the serious head injury he suffered in his 1976 car accident. Traumatic brain injuries, particularly those affecting the frontal lobe, can lead to profound personality changes, emotional instability, obsessive thinking, and impaired judgment. Don's shift from a focused advertising executive to a man deeply engrossed in bizarre historical ideas may reflect such neurological trauma. It's also possible that Kemp initially wandered into the wilderness, then returned or was taken to Casper, as suggested by credible sightings and strange phone calls. If his mental state fluctuated, he may have become overwhelmed or disoriented again, prompting a second departure into the wild, where he ultimately perished. Hey everyone, Jimmy here once again with a quick reminder to hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to click that share button and send my video to your friends and family who enjoy true crime and mystery content. Imagine soaring 70,000 feet above hostile territory, confident that no enemy weapon can reach you. Francis Gary Powers, a pilot for the CIA, had that confidence on May 1st, 1960, as he piloted a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union until a sudden thump and flash of orange light proved him wrong. In an instant, the aircraft lurched out of control, struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Powers desperately tried to stabilize the nose-diving plane, but within moments, he had to eject as it spiraled down over Soviet soil. The ensuing international fallout from this shoot-down would push superpower tensions to a new peak. By 1960, the United States and Soviet Union were locked in a high-stakes chess game, each anxious about the other's nuclear capabilities. President Dwight Eisenhower proposed an open skies plan in 1955, but Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev flatly refused. This plan proposed mutual aerial surveillance between the United States and Soviet Union to reduce surprise nuclear attack risks through transparency and verification. Lacking such transparency, the American government turned to secret high-altitude aerial reconnaissance, an area where there was a significant technological edge over the Soviets. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane was developed to fly at altitudes around 70,000 feet, so high that officials believed it would pass over the Soviet Union undetected. They also believed that it was beyond the reach of Soviet fighters or missiles. While they were right about the former, the latter would be proven very wrong. Starting in 1956, U-2 overflights gathered valuable photographs of Soviet bases and missile sites. The Soviets did track these flights on radar, and even fired on one U-2 in 1959, but Khrushchev kept quiet about these incidents. After all, he didn't yet have any hard proof that these were American planes. Despite his misgivings, Eisenhower allowed U-2 missions to continue for vital intelligence. In April 1960, with a summit looming, he authorized one last deep penetration flight to gather updated intelligence on Soviet nuclear sites. The mission would launch from Pakistan, fly across the breadth of the Soviet Union to photograph key missile sites, and then land in Norway. In the early hours of May 1, 1960, Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in a U-2 loaded with cameras. The Soviets weren't caught by surprise. Anticipating an intruder plane, Soviet air defense units were on high alert along the U-2's planned route. As the U-2 slipped into Soviet airspace, fighter jets tried in vain to intercept the high-flying aircraft. When they weren't successful, ground crews then launched a salvo of surface-to-air missiles near Sverdlovsk in the Ural Mountains. At least one missile exploded close enough to blast apart the fragile spy plane. Powers bailed out from the stricken U-2, struggling at first with his oxygen hose but ultimately parachuting to the ground alive. He carried a poison needle hidden in a silver dollar to avoid capture, but he never used it. Powers was promptly seized by Soviet authorities, and wreckage of his U-2 was recovered for all the world to see. The Soviet authorities proudly exhibited the recovered pieces of Powers' aircraft in Moscow, parading the mangled aircraft parts to prove the American espionage. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, since the way the Soviets broke this news to the world was done to maximize the humiliation to Eisenhower. Back in Washington, news that a U-2 had gone missing over the Soviet Union caused a panic. American officials assumed Powers was likely dead, and the plane completely destroyed, so they hastily concocted a cover story. On May 5th, NASA released a press statement claiming a quote-unquote weather research aircraft had, quote, gone missing north of Turkey. And I guess the Soviet Union technically was north of Turkey, and I guess there were probably some weather instruments on the plane. To bolster this lie, the United States even showed off a U-2 painted with fake NASA markings, pretending it was a harmless high-altitude weather plane. Meanwhile, Khrushchev made a shrewd move. He announced on May 5th that an American spy plane had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory. Khrushchev was a masterful political operator, though, and he didn't put all his cards on the table. He omitted the fact that Powers had survived. Believing their ruse was working, American officials stuck to their fabricated tale for several more days, digging a deeper hole. Khrushchev sprang his trap on May 7th. With obvious relish, he revealed to the Supreme Soviet that the captured pilot Powers was alive and well. Not only that, Soviet recovery teams had retrieved the U-2's sophisticated camera equipment for air-to-ground surveillance. This was truly cutting-edge technology, which at the time wasn't publicly acknowledged to even exist. The American weatherplane story instantly collapsed in perhaps the most humiliating way possible, and the Soviets weren't going to be modest about what just occurred. Khrushchev mocked the Eisenhower administration's attempted deception, noting that he had deliberately let them tell on themselves with ridiculous cover-up statements. Embarrassed on the world stage, the United States had no choice but to admit that Powers had indeed been on an espionage mission. Eisenhower publicly accepted responsibility, acknowledging the spy flights as necessary for national security in the nuclear age. However, he pointedly refused to apologize to the Soviets for conducting the aerial surveillance. This seemingly small detail would help cause a frosting over of American-Soviet relations that became even more pronounced in the decade to come. Khrushchev's personal relationship with Eisenhower had been improving in the late 1950s, and both sides hoped the upcoming Paris summit on May 16, 1960, would be fruitful. In the days before the conference, hardliners in the Kremlin pressed Khrushchev to respond aggressively to the U-2 provocation. When the summit opened in Paris, the Soviet leader launched into a furious tirade against the U.S. and President Eisenhower, then dramatically stormed out of the meeting. The summit collapsed on day one, with no discussions on arms control or anything else achieved. Eisenhower was left bitterly disappointed, considering it one of the worst debacles of his presidency. Had the incident not occurred, Eisenhower lamented, the talks and even a planned goodwill visit of his to Moscow might have significantly improved East-West relations. The Soviets put Francis Gary Powers on trial in Moscow, staging it as a propaganda spectacle. In August 1960, just months after his capture, Powers pleaded guilty to espionage in a Soviet court and was sentenced to 10 years of confinement. The trial, held in a grand hall and heavily publicized, showcased exhibits of the U-2's wreckage and surveillance photos as evidence of American aggression. Powers, however, wouldn't serve the full sentence. After enduring roughly 21 months in Soviet custody, he was exchanged in a prisoner swap on February 10, 1962. Although Powers returned home to public criticism for not destroying his plane or making the ultimate sacrifice, he was cleared of wrongdoing. That said, this didn't stop the speculation at the time. One persistent theory held that Powers deliberately allowed his U-2 to be shot down in an attempt to defect to the Soviet Union. Under this theory, he allowed his plane to fly lower than it ought to, putting it in range of Soviet missiles. Advocates pointed to the mission's deep penetration route, Powers' failure to trigger the aircraft's self-destruct, and his decision not to use the poison needle. Soviet propagandists amplified these claims, portraying him as a willing turncoat disillusioned with American policy. Yet declassified records and later investigations undermine the idea. Powers had no secure means to guarantee capture alive, no prearranged Soviet contacts, and no realistic expectation of humane treatment. All evidence now indicates his erratic descent resulted from missile damage at a high altitude, and this theory is virtually completely dismissed today. Another more interesting theory is that the true purpose of Powers' mission was to be shot down, tossing a wrench into Soviet-American relations. Under this theory, Powers wasn't in on it at all, but elements within the American intelligence apparatus set him up. If this theory is accurate, the people behind the setup did so in order to stop American-Soviet relations from normalizing. While this idea is tempting and is definitely plausible, there's simply no evidence to support it, so it remains in the realm of speculation. Powers ended up working as a test pilot upon his return home and would eventually become an aircraft and helicopter pilot for a local news station in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, while Powers may have successfully survived one crash, in August 1977, his helicopter went down in Encino. Tragically, this crash resulted in the loss of his life, as well as that of his passenger. As far as I know, Powers is the only person to have two Wikipedia articles dedicated to plane crashes where he was the pilot. In October 1979, 19-year-old Lisa Jane Borden phoned her family from California to say she'd be coming home soon. Her loved ones even arranged a plane ticket for her return, but Lisa never showed up to claim it. She had made it all the way from Texas to California on her own, but something, or someone, prevented her from making it back. That brief call was the last time anyone heard from the young Texas woman. Over 4 decades later, her disappearance remains an unsettling cold case, a road trip turned mystery, leaving her family with decades of unanswered questions and heartache. Lisa was from Big Spring, a small West Texas city. In early October 1979, she hitchhiked west to California. For that journey, she likely depended on the kindness of strangers for rides along the highways, an inherently risky way to travel. By October 10th, Lisa had reached the city of Lodi, in California's San Joaquin Valley, and placed a phone call to her family back in Texas. During that call, she reassured them she was safe and planned to return home soon. Her loved ones, including her worried boyfriend, responded by sending her a plane ticket home to be picked up at the airport. Mysteriously, Lisa never retrieved that ticket or boarded any flight. After her conversation from Lodi, she simply vanished without a trace. When Lisa failed to return or contact anyone again, her family grew alarmed. It wasn't like her to cut off communication, especially after travel plans had been made. Sensing something was wrong, Lisa's sister reported her missing to local authorities in Texas. With the case now officially opened, investigators had to retrace Lisa's steps across 2 states. Despite an interstate investigation, the authorities found no physical evidence to reveal Lisa's fate. After her October phone call, there were no confirmed sightings and no belongings or clues left behind to indicate what happened. Detectives confirmed that Lisa had made it to California, but beyond her one phone call, solid clues were scarce. A friend later told the family that Lisa had been spotted back in Texas after her California trip, allegedly living in Amarillo and working as a waitress. This claim briefly raised hopes that Lisa was alive, but the friend provided no details or proof. Authorities were unable to verify the Amarillo story, making it a frustrating dead end and leaving doubt whether the sighting was even real. The Texas Department of Public Safety has classified Lisa's disappearance as an involuntary missing person case. In fact, authorities have stated they believe Lisa may have been taken against her will. Decades after she vanished, investigators updated the case by collecting a DNA sample from her family in 2007 to aid in identification efforts. Her information remains active in national databases, and she's been compared to numerous Jane Doe cases with no success. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what might have happened to Lisa. The leading theory is that she fell victim to foul play during her journey. As a young woman hitchhiking alone in the late 1970s, Lisa was at risk of encountering someone dangerous on the road. In fact, the late 1970s saw a surge of serial violence on the roads. This was an era when serial predators often targeted hitchhikers, and authorities suspect Lisa may have accepted a ride from the wrong person. If she was abducted while traveling, it would explain why she never made it home despite having a ticket waiting. Another consideration is that Lisa could have chosen to disappear and start a new life, though her family finds this unlikely. The Amarillo waitress story was one such lead, though that ultimately went nowhere. However, those who believe that she lived have speculated that she may have fled Amarillo after seeing her old friend where she was working. More than 45 years have passed since Lisa Jane Borden disappeared, and her fate remains unknown. Her family has endured decades of not knowing, holding out hope that one day they might learn what became of her. It's one of the most jarring pivots in modern sports history, a moment where unparalleled jubilation turned into indelible tragedy in less than 48 hours. On Tuesday, June 17, 1986, the Boston Celtics, fresh off another NBA championship, selected the University of Maryland's Len Bias with the second overall pick in the NBA draft. The team's leadership was convinced the young man was the key to extending the Celtics dynasty well into the next generation. Photographers captured Bias beaming while holding up the famed Celtics jersey, number 30, the image of a young man on the cusp of athletic immortality. Yet, by Thursday morning, June 19th, the narrative had shattered completely. The news reports weren't celebrating a future Hall of Famer. They were announcing the death of a 22-year-old from a coke overdose. Bias was born in Landover, Maryland, and excelled as a forward at Northwestern High School in Hyattsville before committing to the University of Maryland. Over his 4 years playing for the Terrapins, from 1982 to 1986, Bias developed into an athletic phenomenon who utterly dominated the Atlantic Coast Conference. The anticipation surrounding his move to the professional level was immense, going far beyond typical draft buzz. Many analysts believed his potential was virtually limitless, and that he could potentially be one of the greatest players of all time if he played his cards right. Experts were even describing him in the same sentence of the already legendary Michael Jordan. The tragic events unfolded swiftly in the early morning hours of June 19, 1986. After returning to his dorm room, Bias joined a small gathering of friends and teammates. Testimony later revealed that sometime between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m., Bias, alongside his friends and teammates, began huffing Colombian confetti. The substance was reportedly piled on a mirror in the center of the dorm suite. For the next 3 to 4 hours, the group talked and snorted the polar bear powder. And then it happened. Out of the blue, Bias suffered a seizure and collapsed. A 911 call was placed at 6:32 that morning, reporting that the celebrated athlete was unconscious and not breathing. Despite desperate attempts by emergency medical teams and further efforts at Leland Memorial Hospital in Riverdale, Maryland, Bias was pronounced dead at 8:55. The medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia brought on by an overdose. Importantly, toxicology reports confirmed that there were no other substances in his system. While the immediate shock focused on the suddenness of his death, the initial public narrative was quickly established by authorities and the media. Bias was an innocent victim, perhaps trying coke only this one time, or possibly even being duped into ingesting it. However, this simple account soon collapsed under the weight of an investigation, and I really question how anyone could have been so naive as to believe that story. Grand jury testimony from Bias's teammates contradicted the prevailing story, indicating that Bias had reportedly used the substance almost 10 times prior. The revelation of Bias's drug use and the ensuing police investigation immediately hurled the University of Maryland and its athletic department into deep turmoil. The focus quickly shifted from the personal tragedy of the athlete to the integrity of the institution responsible for managing him. Allegations of a major cover-up within the athletic program soon emerged. State Attorney Arthur Marshall publicly alleged that in the hours after Bias's collapse, Maryland's head basketball coach had instructed players to destroy any substances they had. Importantly, this allegation was never proven in a court of law, but that didn't matter. This claim of obstruction, combined with the wider questions about the special treatment afforded to top college athletes, signaled a systemic failure at the highest levels of the university. The administration launched full investigations into the athletic program's academic standards and drug use policies. The ensuing controversy was so devastating that it forced high-level resignations, including those of the basketball head coach and the athletic director, amongst others. The grand jury investigation led to criminal charges against those present during Bias's death. Brian Tribble, Bias's friend, was indicted on multiple serious counts, including possession of coke and possession with intent to distribute. Teammates Terry Long and David Gregg also faced charges of possession and obstruction of justice. They were suspended from the basketball team shortly thereafter. Despite the overwhelming public pressure and the severity of the charges, the state justice system ultimately failed to secure any convictions related directly to Bias's death. In June 1987, a jury acquitted Brian Tribble of all charges concerning distribution and possession in the Bias case. Prosecutors later dismissed the misdemeanor charges against Long and Gregg as well. Len Bias's death occurred at a specific moment when politicians were eager to be seen as tough on drugs, and the media was heavily focused on the dangers of crack. This is, of course, despite the fact that Len Bias and his friends hadn't been smoking Timu nose candy at all. The political machinery moved with astonishing speed. Committees in the House began writing anti-drug legislation within weeks of Bias's passing. The legislative process bypassed normal deliberation and research, driven by political expediency and public panic. The resulting legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan on October 27, 1986. This was brought in just 4 months after Bias's death, and to many observers, the connection between the law and the actual facts of his case weren't readily apparent. This new federal statute, often dubbed the Len Bias Law, dramatically escalated penalties for substance-related crimes. The key provision established harsh mandatory minimum sentences, specifically targeting cases where drug distribution led to the death or serious bodily injury of the user. For such offenses, the law mandated a minimum prison term of 20 years and a maximum life sentence, even for a first-time offender. Crucially, the law made no distinction between a major international trafficker and an individual who gave a friend a dose for free. If death resulted, both could be charged and face life imprisonment. This elimination of judicial discretion, enacted in a political fever pitch, fundamentally reshaped the American criminal justice system. The Len Bias Law is frequently cited as a primary catalyst for the explosion of mass incarceration in the decades that followed. Some have, of course, speculated that the law was already pre-planned and that politicians were simply waiting for the right national tragedy to capitalize upon. On the night of March 20th, 1995, 17-year-old Julie Ferguson left work at the Linens and Things store in Greenbelt, Maryland, and prepared to go out with friends. She was a junior at Eleanor Roosevelt High School, a bright, vivacious teen known for her love of music and close bonds with her friends. Around 9:30 p.m., after closing up the store, Julie waited outside in the Greenway Shopping Center for two friends who had promised to give her a ride that evening. Moments before, she had reassured her mother by phone that her friends were on their way to pick her up. The area was well lit by a nearby liquor store, and Julie sat on a brick planter box with a soda and a shopping bag by her side. Sometime before 10 p.m., witnesses saw Julie casually chatting with the occupants of a red four-door car that had pulled up near where she waited. There were 3 people in the vehicle, reportedly 2 young men and a young woman, and by all accounts, Julie seemed comfortable speaking with them. Observers noted no signs of distress or struggle at that time. However, by the time her friends arrived just after 10 p.m., Julie had vanished without a trace. All that remained were her belongings on the curb including a bag of clothes and her soda bottle. Alarmed, her friends contacted Julie's mother and questioned the liquor store manager, quickly realizing something was terribly wrong. Within hours, Greenbelt police, aided by police helicopters, began searching the area for the missing teen. Tragically, the search ended early the next morning. At around 5:20 a.m. on March 21st, a pair of workers on their way to their job spotted Julie's body near a wooded stretch of Daisy Lane in Glendale, about 5 miles from the shopping center. She was found fully clothed on the remote roadside, and the manner of her death was brutal. An autopsy later revealed that Julie had been strangled and her throat had been slashed. There were no signs of essay, robbery, or any obvious motive for the attack. Simply put, there was absolutely nothing to explain why someone would target a normal girl who was just going about her evening. Julie's slaying sent shockwaves through the Greenbelt community, which was unaccustomed to such violent crime. In the days that followed, police worked around the clock interviewing dozens of people, but they struggled to develop solid leads. No immediate suspect emerged, and detectives could not determine a clear motive for the crime. Julie had no apparent enemies, and nothing obvious had been taken from her. Investigators quickly concluded that she had been abducted from the shopping center, but by whom and for what purpose remained a complete mystery. The only early clues were the witness accounts of the red car and the disturbing fact that some of Julie's personal items had been discarded along a roadway. Her ID, for instance, was later found tossed in the median of Greenbelt Road, about halfway between the mall and the location where her body was found. It appeared those responsible had scattered a few of her belongings while fleeing the area. The impact on Julie's peers was profound. 2 days after the slaying, well over 1,000 people gathered for a candlelight vigil at the Eleanor Roosevelt High School football field to mourn Julie and seek solace together. Grief counselors were made available to students overcome by the shock of losing a classmate in such a horrific way. Friends described feeling as if all the safety and all the security of their world had been stripped away overnight. Despite an intensive investigation in 1995, the case gradually went cold as months and then years passed without an arrest. The crime scene yielded little forensic evidence beyond some physical items belonging to Julie, and with no eyewitnesses to the abduction itself, detectives had few leads to pursue. About 5 years after the slaying, in March 2000, Prince George's County Police announced a renewed push in Julie's case, and with it, some intriguing new clues. Cold case investigators had spent months re-examining the evidence and re-interviewing witnesses. At a press conference on the case's 5-year anniversary, police revealed that previously overlooked witness accounts pointed to 3 suspects who might have been involved. Crucially, multiple people had reported seeing a red Volkswagen Jetta in the Greenway Center parking lot the night Julie disappeared. The occupants were described as 2 men and 1 woman in their early 20s, and all were noted to be black. One witness saw Julie leaning in the window of this car, talking to the occupants shortly before she vanished. Another witness came forward to say they had spotted a similar vehicle in the early morning hours parked along a remote stretch of Daisy Lane, with its headlights on. Notably, this was in the very area where Julie's body was later discovered, giving rise to suspicions that this may have been the occupants of the vehicle dumping her body. By the time that witness passed the spot again, the car was gone. Around this same period, police explored a lead involving a different possible suspect entirely. They identified a person of interest, who was a white male who was believed to have been preying on young women near the University of Maryland campus in the mid-1990s. This individual was thought to have attempted abductions in the area, raising suspicions that Julie could have been a victim of a serial predator. However, after extensive efforts, investigators were unable to track that man down or link him to the crime. The focus remained on the trio in the red car, even as the case once again began to stall for lack of concrete proof. Over the years, several theories have emerged about who was responsible for the slaying of Julie Ferguson, but many have led to dead ends. Aside from the theories already discussed, two young men who knew Julie were also investigated as possible suspects. However, both of them failed to match up to DNA found at the scene, and there was nothing concrete to link either men to the abduction and subsequent events. The primary theory that law enforcement still focuses on centers around the three unknown individuals in the red car. Investigators have urged any of these three people to come forward for questioning in an effort to potentially clear their names if they weren't involved.